Language, if we didn't do it so naturally, it would be a form of magic. And in fact, to quote Freud, who was also an aspiring anthropologist as well as a philosopher, is words were originally magic. English in particular has a number of examples, and what I want to do is to introduce those as a way into language patterns. Probably the best known one, and this goes back to like the 20s or 30s when there were several semanticists writing about this. They pointed out that when somebody says, "Oh, she's sweet," or they say, "Well, his ideas are really subpar," that when somebody says a sentence like that, "she's sweet," that it doesn't mean anything about her. The form of the sentence is, "She is sweet." And the person who's asserting that was the speaker, but that part of the sentence got left off. The part where I said, "In my opinion, she is sweet." And the owning of the source of the utterance, the owning of who was manufacturing the thought and making the evaluation is totally missing. What people go, "Oh, well, I guess she's sweet because somebody said so." Now, you wouldn't think this would be crucial, except human beings delete source automatically. It's kind of a problem recently. And by the way, I'm one of those people that says that fake news and all that stuff with the internet, it's not a fault, it's a feature. It's the nature of the domain space. The fact on the internet, the source is being obliterated. You just get information. And what is the source of it? Now, some people still care about that. Some people want curated sources like the failing New York Times. And other people want it curated, by Wild Buffaloes Reign Free or some other curating source. Interpersonally, in conversation and in all of our discourse still, this is pretty much unrealized. The power of the verb to be. So is, are. So his ideas are not worthwhile. The first language pattern is to build an equivalence. Because when you say this person is sweet, well, that's actually saying this is that. This is equal to that. And it also says, well, that's all she is sweetness, which it isn't really saying that, but the way language works is it points our attention at certain aspects of experience, and we tend to just delete away the rest of it. And this is how language patterns get certain kinds of lawyers into trouble on cross and redirect. It would be very different for me to say, well, she is often quite sweet. Suddenly a different kind of picture begins to emerge. She's sweet sometimes. He has a few worthwhile ideas. And so just even these slight changes of language will affect what we make of that equivalence. That this isn't really equal to that. But as I say, this magic we can do with language, we can make things equal that aren't equal at all. And this is where we can go back to your example of these lawsuits which are all considered frivolous, even though they might be as different as coffee, fender benders, tripping, all these very different experiences. And yet somehow those are all equivalent to frivolous. Whereas on the other side, these very different cases, and yet those are all equivalent to meritorious. And so the bigger thing we have here is how do we get those experiences I was drawing, how do we get the experiences in or out of one meaning frame or another meaning frame? How are they getting in there, and then how can we move them out or around if that's something that seems like it's worthwhile or important to do? Because people are not doing this thoughtfully for the most part. Some philosophers are doing this, some philosophers are doing this thoughtfully, and the rest of us are just taking it in. So that's the first magic trick. Nothing in nature is equivalent. Twins are not equivalent. There's differences. There's fewer than they thought and still more than, So the second magic trick, similar to the first one, is if you begin a sentence with this is, that is, there are, the, or something like that, and whatever you say after that will be perceived as a fact. George Bush, famous for his "there are dangerous people in the world," or Trump with his "the failing New York Times." And the thing is about this is that it's the nature of the language. What it does is, similar to what you were asking, is it drops the source completely. And here's a strange thing about the nature of language. If I say the New York Times is failing, well, then it's my opinion or my perceptual position, my situated view, and you can quiz me about it. You can go, well, on what basis do you say that? But if the language changes to there is or that is, or it is, or the, then with that language, there is no specific source. And what our brains default to is, well, everybody must believe that. I know that sounds crazy, so I'll take a moment to let it sink in. Is when we don't have a first-person source for something, and it comes out in third person, as we say in some grammar books, as they, them, those, it generalizes to that entire group. It generalizes the entire statement. In my business, the answer to this is whom specifically, or according to whom specifically. And by the way, it's very often in the work I do, the first question I ask, because people do this a lot. People use a lot of statements where they simply assert something. And they might be the author of it. Yeah, they might be the person who thought of it. But I want to check, because very often they're also not the author of it. They just picked it up somewhere. And so this goes to what you were just saying about what about when it's less specific? Well, the less specific it is, the more universal it feels. And so, as I say, the reason this is called lost performative in linguistics, that's the LP, not long playing record. But the other term for it is a factive, because it feels like a fact, but it's not one. It's frivolous lawsuits that are ruining the American just system of justice. Now, I said this before, but I'll repeat it, is I happen to know that over 90% of all lawsuits are between corporations. And they may be frivolous, but that's not what the authors of that statement are talking about. Because when it's for hundreds of millions of dollars and billions of dollars, of course, it's not frivolous, just by default there. But when you assert the phrase, it evokes an experience. Remember, the words are evoking an experience. The person goes, it's the frivolous lawsuits that are ruining America's wonderful and sacred court system, our form of justice. And of course, any person in this room, because you have more details about this, will go, no, wait a minute. But going back to your example of the situation of all these medical terms and people that don't know them, if they're less versed in that, then this is the fact they got. And it goes in without a source along with all the other facts they've got. And if it's been encouraged into a constellation of facts, we talked about last time, if it has a conceptual framework, such as has been organized on purpose by the conservative movements in the US, then they have places to hang all those ideas together. And it makes sense in some weird way. And the less deliberate other side of it, on the liberal side, where all these other ideas seem to fit together in some way, there's this conceptual framework. Well, the idea doesn't slide into that one, doesn't go there. So so the first magic trick is things being made equivalent, even though they aren't. And the second magic trick is that things can be turned into facts simply by having no source for them. As I say, these would be real magic if it weren't something we were so familiar with. The third magic trick is you can't get rid of something by putting a negative sign in front of it. George Lakoff, who's tried to educate the liberals and Democrats to this, entitled his book, Don't Think of an Elephant, trying to get an understanding that if you put a negative in front of the word elephant, it doesn't stop you from thinking about it. You'll think about it. When you want people not to think something, putting a negative in front of it won't work. Don't think of this as a frivolous lawsuit, for example. They'll go, oh, frivolous lawsuit. Because they have to access that thought and then put in the negative. Now, I watched a defense attorney who's, I guess, well known in certain circles do this with some forethought and knowledge when he said, I'm no Perry Mason. Older fellow, obviously appealing to himself and older jurors, or anybody that stays up too late at night. And the thing is, he even did it in a nicely self-deprecating, well, I'm no Perry Mason. But he goes, but I'm gonna try. And sure enough, in that case, it primed some of the jurors, primed meaning a kind of pre-anchored them to begin to look for his Perry Mason moment. Now, he had this other thing. He had almost acting skills, or maybe they were acting skills. Every once in a while, he would just stop in the courtroom and look. And then he'd turn and walk again. No, and the thing is that even though I know 2 times I watched him, had nothing to do with anything. But when he did that, all the jurors on that side of the room, they stopped breathing. Was this the Perry Mason moment? Was he going to do the reveal? Because we know Perry Mason's always a reveal, I did it. So this is, again, evoking experiences, not reflecting reality. Perry Mason isn't real, he's not Perry Mason, but by the magic of language, by the artful use of negation, he was able to bring up that idea. And I've seen other lawyers making a hash of something because of their inability to not to think something. Not realizing that you do this on the inside of your head, and then on the outside you tell them what you want them to think about. Unless you want them to think about something, and then you could put it like, don't think that way, like the defense attorney did. I hate to bore people with them, but it's a lovely experiment where they ask a group of people, how many nations on the United Nations are from Africa? And then they spin one of those big number dials with 0 to 100 on it. But they already know that with one group it's going to stop at 25, and with another group it's going to stop at 75. And then when it stops at 25, the group systematically guesses a lower number for the number of nations from Africa. And when it's high, they systematically remember a higher number. So, and this is why it's called anchoring, and there's a second term there about anchoring and adjustment. That people will begin to anchor around that number. They'll go, okay, well, it can't be 20. You get in the jury room and they'll go, well, it can't be 25. Then, well, 23 is not 25. We have one more magic trick for the moment, and I know you know what it is. I know he doesn't know what it is, but I know you know what it is. Do you realize I'm bullshitting, or do you realize I'm telling the truth? What's my intention? Okay, all of those words have to do with me knowing something about what's going on over in you that I could not possibly know, but the language makes it seem like I would. As in, I know you're upset. Well, now, if the person is going, there's a good chance you're in the ballpark, right? But the more specific that gets in use, the less likely, and people do use it that way. So saying, I know you know, and in fact I know you know, but you may not know to say what it is at this moment. But what it is you've got the category of he knows, and then you've got this higher, I know what you know. As I say, I know he knows what the next pattern is, next magic trick is in language, and I know you don't know. Yeah, I realize you don't know, or do you realize you don't know? What it's doing is I'm claiming knowledge of your inner thoughts. So there's all of your inner experience, and I'm claiming that I know your inner experience. There are abilities, and some people in the room have been working on those, to be able to read people's nonverbals, but we have a phrase in our business called, calibrate before you hallucinate. In other words, before you think you know what the person's thinking, really look at them and check it out. And then, if at all possible, test it in some way. And test by counterexample. Don't test by believing you're right. Test by doing the opposite. Because it's really likely you're not right. As I say, we are built as creatures, as long as you haven't had Botox, to get some read on the other person. But it's an approximation, but people don't treat it as an approximation. This magic of language, people will say, oh, I know what she's thinking. I know what the jury wants. I realize what we need to tell the defense. What any of those is making something what it isn't. People hear things like that, and somebody says, I know, blah, blah, blah. Yeah, when people hear that, and they act as if somehow that person has knowledge, instead of asking the obvious question, how do you know? Again, this slides right by us. Now, the difference is this, is that a factive is a third-person universal statement.
Right.
This is a fact, this is that way. If somebody says, I know, then a person is asserting they have this special knowledge of the inner feelings or thoughts or condition or whatever of something else. Actually, there's an implicit authoritarianism. I might know stuff about, I know what you're thinking. I have been a psychoanalyst for many decades. There's even an implicit authority to it, that I know better about what's going on with you, because I'm more experienced. It's not just I know that there are 3 chairs there. It's when you're asserting something about unseen. I know what Amy's going to do with this stuff later. Not only can't verify it, I didn't verify it, and I have no basis for it. Yeah. Now, this will all make, the choice of measures will all make sense in the next section.